1994. A big-budget science fiction epic hits theaters after nearly every major studio in Hollywood passed on it. The most powerful film critic in the country trashes it in print. A man who never wanted to act again somehow ends up playing its most iconic villain. And somehow, against every single odds stacked against it, that film becomes a cultural juggernaut that spawns a television empire lasting decades. For spin-off series, hundreds of episodes, novels, comic books, and video games. This is the story of Stargate, and almost nothing about how it got made makes sense. Stick around until the end, because the final fact on this list is the one that quietly reshaped how every studio on Earth markets a movie, and almost nobody realizes it happened. Long before Stargate was Stargate, it was two separate ideas that had nothing to do with each other. In the late 1970s, a young film student in Munich named Roland Emmerich watched a documentary inspired by Erich von Daniken's ancient astronaut theories. The idea that visitors from beyond Earth had shaped early human civilization, particularly in Egypt. Emmerich, already fascinated by Egyptian history, started sketching out a concept about a buried alien spacecraft beneath the pyramids tied to a string of disappearances. He called it Necropolis. Nobody in the German film industry wanted to fund something so strange, so he shelved it for over a decade. Meanwhile, a young actor named Dean Devlin was working on Emmerich's 1990 film Moon 44, quietly rewriting bits of his own dialogue on set even though directing wasn't his job. Devlin had his own concept brewing, something he liked to describe as an adventure epic in the vein of Lawrence of Arabia, except set on another world, following a hero chasing a villain through some kind of gateway into a conquered civilization. When the two men finally sat down and compared notes, they realized their separate ideas shared a missing piece, a device that could move people somewhere else entirely. A concept artist working with them suggested building the whole story around a single mysterious object, and that's when the Stargate itself was born. Two unrelated ideas, shelved for years, combined into one of science fiction's longest-running franchises because two men happened to work together on an unrelated project first. When Emmerich and Devlin first pitched their combined concept to studios, the response was not encouraging. Executives figured a film this ambitious would cost somewhere around $100 million, an astronomical figure for the era. Emmerich insisted he could bring it in for roughly half that. Nobody believed him. And the pitch also had a second problem. Nobody could figure out what genre box to put it in. Was it a war film, an adventure film, ancient history, straight science fiction? Studios tend to hate things they can't categorize cleanly, and Stargate refused to fit anywhere. Eventually, the project found a champion in producer Mario Kassar, who had a genuine passion for Egyptian art and could see the appeal that other executives couldn't. But money remained tight. And according to accounts from the production, Devlin represented the budget to a French co-financing partner as considerably lower than what it would actually end up costing. By the time the real number became apparent, the French company was already committed. They didn't walk away. It's a strange thing to sit with. An entire franchise spanning 10 seasons of one series, multiple spin-offs, and a fan base that still gathers at conventions today, all traces back in part to a budget figure that wasn't entirely honest. RA needed to be terrifying, magnetic, and completely believable as a being an entire civilization would worship as a god. The filmmakers set their sights on Jay Davidson, who wasn't a trained actor at all, but a London fashion designer who had stumbled into film almost by chance a couple of years earlier. That stumble had landed him an Academy Award nomination for The Crying Game, a film that thrust him into a spotlight he hated. He'd already decided that movie would be his first and last. When producer Mario Kassar suggested him for RA, partly because the Oscar nomination would help sell the film overseas, Davidson didn't want to simply say no outright. Instead, he asked for $1 million, a number he assumed was so absurd it would end the conversation. The production agreed immediately. Davidson found himself starring as the villain in a $50 million science fiction epic he never intended to make. During post-production, his voice was completely reconstructed in the studio, layered and distorted into something otherworldly that wasn't his natural voice at all. At the film's first screening, producer Dean Devlin reportedly found Davidson in tears afterward, convinced his performance had ruined the picture. After Stargate, Davidson largely walked away from acting for good, appearing in only a small handful of projects afterward before returning to fashion. One of the genre's most memorable villains was played by a man who tried everything he could to avoid the job. James Spader, cast as awkward, brilliant Egyptologist Daniel Jackson, reportedly thought the original script was rough, and not in a way he found charming. By most accounts, part of what drew him to the project in the first place was how flawed the writing was. There was something interesting to him buried underneath the mess. But when he arrived on set and felt the dialogue still wasn't working, he apparently refused to come out of his trailer until changes were made. Kurt Russell, playing the no-nonsense Colonel O'Neill opposite him, went to confront him directly, and the exchange that reportedly followed has become a well-worn piece of behind-the-scenes lore. Spader pointing out how bad the dialogue was, and Russell firing back that that's exactly why they were being paid so well to say it. Whatever the exact wording, the underlying story checks out. According to the film's writers, both actors eventually found the film's tone a knowing, almost affectionate homage to classic pulp science fiction. And once they understood the kind of movie they were actually making, they leaned into it fully. Sometimes the person causing friction on a production is the one pushing it towards something better. You know the shot. The Stargate activates in a burst of energy, followed by a swirling mass, followed by a shimmering rippled surface. Visual effects supervisor Jeffrey Oken and director Roland Emmerich reportedly clashed constantly over how this should look. Pitch after pitch got rejected. Eventually, in a garage test, Oken's team filled a small circular tank with a powdered drink mix, the kind used to make iced tea, and spun the liquid using a motor rigged to a wooden board. Emmerich reportedly hated the resulting footage and fired Oken on the spot. But Oken still had his crew, his equipment, and hours left in the day, so instead of packing up, they kept experimenting. They rigged an air cannon to the tank. Their first attempt blasted the entire contents outward, soaking the cinematographer completely. They adjusted the pressure, tried again, and captured a forward burst of liquid energy that would go on to become one of science fiction's most recognizable visual signatures. Oken reportedly went back to Emmerich, technically still fired, and told him he needed to see the new footage anyway. Emmerich watched it and decided this was exactly the effect he'd wanted all along. One of the film's most enduring images was created by a crew that, technically, had already been let go. Before it became the double-ring circular device audiences know, the Stargate prop reportedly started out painted a flat black, closer in appearance to a giant tire than anything otherworldly, and had to be repainted multiple times before landing on its final look. But the more significant change was structural. The earliest concept had the Stargate as a triangular obelisk meant to stand upright like a monument. Once Emmerich decided he wanted a dramatic mechanical dialing sequence, with glyphs rotating and chevrons locking into place, the triangular shape became a problem. A triangle can't rotate smoothly the way a circle can. The design shifted to a ring, and from that shift came the now iconic structure of an inner spinning ring set inside a larger outer ring lined with chevrons. What almost became a stationary alien monument turned into one of science fiction's most recognizable rotating machines. The film opens in 1928, showing archaeologists uncovering the Stargate in Giza. It would be easy to assume the expedition's dialogue is in French or perhaps German, given the historical setting of a European-led dig in colonial-era Egypt. Instead, the archaeologists are speaking Swedish. There's no widely documented explanation for this choice in interviews, commentary tracks, or production notes. It's simply there unexplained, in the middle of a scene set in a British and French colonial context. Decades later, nobody involved has offered a clear answer as to why. The film's fictional military facility, the massive underground chamber housing the Stargate deep beneath a mountain in Colorado, was actually filmed inside the dome in Long Beach, California, that once housed Howard Hughes's Spruce Goose, the enormous wooden flying boat that remains one of the largest aircraft ever built. Hughes famously flew the plane exactly once. There's something fitting about a structure built to house one man's spectacular, singular aviation obsession becoming the set for a story about humanity discovering something that rewrites its entire understanding of its own history. Filming for the alien world of Abydos took place on location in the Yuma, Arizona desert during the summer of 1993, chosen partly because it was remote enough to avoid crowds and off-road vehicles that plagued more accessible desert locations. But the alien planet needed to feel populated, like a civilization that had existed under Ra's rule for generations, and the budget didn't stretch far enough to fill every distant shot with paid extras. So the production reportedly placed cloth-covered stick figures out in the far dunes to suggest a bustling background population. In wide shots of Abydos, some of the distant figures moving faintly in the wind aren't people at all. Nobody in the audience noticed, and the film went on to break box office records anyway. Before Kurt Russell and James Spader were cast, several very different actors were reportedly considered or approached. Sean Connery was offered the role of Colonel O'Neill and turned it down. Wesley Snipes, at the height of his action star momentum in the early 90s, was also approached and declined. Russell himself reportedly turned the role down more than once before eventually accepting. For Daniel Jackson, Matthew Broderick was considered, someone who would have brought a lighter, more comedic energy to the role than Spader's anxious intensity. And for R.A., the character was originally conceived as an older human male rather than an alien in human form, with the legendary stage actor Sir John Gielgud reportedly among those considered before the role transformed into what eventually went to J. Davidson. The version of Stargate audiences know is the result of a long chain of other actors saying no. Early test screenings for Stargate reportedly landed only around 40% positive response from audiences, a number that in any era of Hollywood tends to spell serious trouble, sometimes leading to reshoots, delayed releases, or outright shelving. At the time, the production companies behind the film were already facing financial pressure, which made a poor box office outcome a genuinely serious risk, not just for the movie, but for the studios themselves. Confidence going into release was reportedly low across the board. And then the film opened, setting a record at the time for the highest-grossing October opening weekend in box office history. Test screenings measure a narrow slice of reaction in an artificial setting. They are not the same thing as how a wide audience responds once a film is actually released into the world. In 1994, celebrated film critic Roger Ebert, whose opinion could shape a film's cultural standing almost single-handedly, named Stargate among his most disliked films of the year. Not simply mediocre, but genuinely disliked. That happened the same calendar year. The film broke box office records for its opening weekend. The gap between critical reception and audience enthusiasm couldn't have been wider, and that tension has followed Stargate ever since. A franchise that grew into hundreds of television episodes, multiple spin-off series, novels, and games, built on a foundation one of America's most influential critics openly disliked. Sometimes a story finds precisely the audience it was made for, regardless of what professional critics decide about it. In 1995, right as Stargate was beginning its transition from a single film into a television franchise, an Egyptologist student named Omar Zudi filed a lawsuit claiming the film had plagiarized a manuscript he'd written years earlier, seeking an enormous sum in damages. The timing mattered enormously. Stargate SG-1 premiered in 1997, just a few years after the lawsuit was filed. Had the legal battle dragged on or succeeded, the resources and creative energy required to fight it could have delayed or derailed the television expansion entirely. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed, but the franchise that eventually produced 10 seasons of one series and multiple additional spin-offs exists on the other side of a legal challenge most fans have never even heard about. Emmerich and Devlin reportedly always envisioned Stargate as the opening chapter of a 3-film story, not a franchise built for television. The planned second film would reportedly have explored Mayan civilization and mythology, suggesting the same ancient alien influence that shaped Egypt had also shaped Mesoamerica. A third film would have tied every major mythological tradition in human history back to a single common origin. Instead, the studio opted for a television series. Stargate SG-1 premiered in 1997 and ran for a decade, ultimately producing far more story than a trilogy ever could have. But the three-film arc, as originally conceived, was never made. The ending the creators originally imagined only exists in old interviews and outline notes. This is the fact that quietly outweighs everything else on this list. In 1994, years before social media, before streaming, before viral marketing was a concept anyone had a name for, Dean Devlin reportedly built a website for Stargate, one of the earliest official movie websites to exist. By today's standards, it would look almost laughably basic, just photos and promotional text. But at the time, no other film had attempted anything like it. The internet in 1994 wasn't yet a marketing tool. It was still mostly the territory of universities and early adopters. Devlin apparently saw potential in it years before most of Hollywood did. Every studio movie website that has existed since, every social media account run by a film's marketing team, every viral countdown page and hidden online teaser traces its lineage back to that early, simple page. A science fiction film about Egyptian gods and alien wormholes, made on a bluff budget, starring a reluctant villain, built around an effect invented from Ice-T Mix by a crew that had technically been fired, filmed partly inside Howard Hughes's old airplane hangar, quietly changed how every movie after it would be sold to the world. By every conventional measure, Stargate shouldn't have worked. The budget situation should have collapsed the production. The test screenings should have buried the release. The reluctant star should have walked. The fired effects team should have gone home. The lawsuit should have poisoned the franchise before it started. The critics weren't kind. None of that stopped it. What we got instead was any who'd get a kick out of learning the Stargate prop used to look like a giant black tire. Send this their way.